Good morning, everybody. We have an amazing show today. Krystal,
Indeed,
what do we have for everybody?
Because Ryan Grimm is in the house, and he did us the kindness of making some big news yesterday in the State Department briefing, asking some fantastic questions and getting some absolutely horrific answers, so we will break that down for you. Also got Dr. Trita Parsi coming in to break down the escalating risks of a wider war. This is something we've been tracking from the beginning, and it has never been as fraught and as dangerous as right now. Bernie Sanders finally coming out strong on Israel. We will tell you about his shift. We've got new details of Biden's political trouble and how they plan to try to get out of it. And the long-awaited Epstein docs released, unsealed.
We've got some of them. Court
records unsealed. And I would just say there's some powerful names. Bill Clinton comes up quite a bit. Donald Trump is there, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing like that we didn't already know, right, I would say, but still kind of shocking. We also got a really interesting response from Alan Dershowitz that we'll play for you as well. Wall Street also with a new strategy to become America's landlord. We'll break that down for you, and I have a look at how Gaza is entering an outright famine and what that means for our country and certainly for the people there in Gaza. But we wanted to go ahead and start with Ryan in that State Department hearing, asking Matthew Miller about the increasingly common remarks that are being made by high-level Israeli officials calling for ethnic cleansing of Gazans out of the Gaza Strip. Let's take a listen to that.
Pick up on your response to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir yesterday. You and Linda Thomas Greenfield both had similar statements. You both said in your statements, quote, "There should be no mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza." Given that you both had the same word-for-word statement, it seems like there was thought put into that. Why use the word should there? There should be no mass displacement. Would you be willing to make a more definitive comment? Like there must
not be. Yeah. No,
and then to get to Ben-Gvir's response, which I'm sure you saw, he posted on Twitter, "With all due respect, we are not another star on the American flag. The United States is our best friend, but first of all, we will do what is best for the state of Israel. The emigration of hundreds of thousands from Gaza will allow the residents of the enclave or the envelope to return home and live in safety and to protect the IDF soldiers." Any response to Ben-Gvir's public response to you?
So certainly Israel is a sovereign country that does make its own decisions. There is no dispute about that. The point of our of the statement that I made yesterday was that the comments that Ben-Gvir and Minister Smotrich have made are in direct contradiction of Israeli government policy, as has been represented to us by multiple Israeli government officials, including the Prime Minister himself. So I'm not surprised that he continues to double down and make those statements, but they are not only in contradiction with United States policy and what we think is in the best interests of the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, the broader region, and ultimately stability in the world, but they are in direct contradiction of his own government's policy, and we believe those statements should stop.
Direct contradiction of Israeli government policy. Ryan, what'd you make of that response?
I like the very end where he said, "We believe those statements should stop." It's like, because you're putting us in a really difficult position when you keep saying the quiet part out loud.
Right.
It's difficult to say that top ministers in a government are contradicting the government's policy.
Right, because they are the government.
They are the government. Now, he's right that there is a higher figure in the government, and that is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But as Netanyahu just speaking fairly recently, saying we're not rejecting that possibility, and the possibility is, quote unquote, scenario of surrender and deportation. There are claims to be made for and against it. In my article at The Intercept that I posted last night, I have a quote from Netanyahu from fairly recently where he says, "Regarding voluntary emigration, I have no problem with that. Our problem is not allowing the exit, but a lack of countries that are ready to take Palestinians in, and we are working on it. This is the direction we are going in," which seems to be in line with what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are saying.
That's right. And in line, by the way, with, according to polling, what the Israeli public wants and is open to. And by the way, I don't know if you guys remember this, all the way back, in the early days after October 7th, Tony Blinken went to Israel. This is when he went and said, "I'm here as a Jewish person, first and foremost." And he made comments at the time pushing back on the idea of setting up some sort of a tent city, saying, "I spoke with Sisi and this is completely off the table." But it was a tell that the Israeli government was already pushing in this direction of expelling Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. We know because, we've covered all of these pieces extensively here. There was a report that came out from a government ministry saying, hey, here's our options for the day after. The one we prefer is pushing everybody out into the Sinai Desert. We know we have reports that Netanyahu has tasked one of his senior advisors with, quote unquote, coming up with plans to thin out the Gaza population. We know there's a plan that's been floated here in the US with some bipartisan support to use aid dollars, our aid dollars, to pressure regional countries to accept refugees out of the Gaza Strip. So to say that it's a direct contradiction of Israeli government policy is just, it's not even inaccurate, it's just a lie. And put the second element up here. I mean, you get pieces like this almost literally every day. This is the Times of Israel reporting Israeli officials are in talks with Congo and other African countries on taking in Gaza immigrants. Let me read a little bit of this. Their Hebrew sister site reported that Israeli officials have held clandestine talks with the African nation of Congo and several others for potential acceptance of Gaza immigrants. Congo will be willing to take in migrants, and we are in talks with others, a senior source in the security cabinet told that outlet. They also quote Intelligence Minister Gila Gamliel saying at the Knesset yesterday, at the end of the war, Hamas will collapse. There are no municipal authorities. The civilian population will be entirely dependent on humanitarian aid. There will be no work, and 60% of Gaza's agricultural land will become security buffer zones. And this is the other piece, Ryan, that has been laid out very clearly, because in that original government ministry plan that I think was sort of like strategically or tactically released as a trial balloon, they laid out how they would do it. They said, basically, we'll destroy Gaza and then we'll make it the quote-unquote humanitarian, that's right, start in the north and then we'll proceed from there and we'll make it the humanitarian option so that we put pressure on U.S. and other countries of like, well, they're either going to starve and get bombed to death or they can be allowed to quote-unquote voluntarily migrate out of the Strip.
And the best counter argument that I've seen, and since Sagar's not here, I'll try to make a counter argument.
Okay.
You would say that there's a war going on and you have to displace the population so that the population is not dying under the rain of these bombs. And in fact, after my question, the Associated Press reporter pressed Matt Miller on this. He said, well, you said you're against the displacement of millions of Palestinians. There's already been displacement.
They've already been displaced.
And he said, well, that's different. They're getting out of harm's way because of the battle. Okay, let's say that, of course, yes, you don't want civilians killed. There was another option that did not involve kicking them into the Sinai Desert, and that is the Negev, the desert that is just on the other side of the Gaza fence. There was nothing stopping Israel from building a tent city, a refugee camp, just a few miles away from Gaza and saying, look, come into Israeli territory here. We've got, they could heavily guard it. It's not as if they're going to, go from there into Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And then when the war is over, they come back in. But that's the part of it that made that option never on the table for Israel, because the plan was never that they would come back into a kind of reconstructed Gaza after the war. It was go into the Sinai, and then from there, some of them stay and the rest are dispersed around the world.
I also think this is very typical of the U.S. approach and certainly the Biden administration approach to Israel is they may verbally signal some discomfort with this or that action, this or that plan, while they are speeding weapons and support and providing diplomatic cover that inevitably leads to Israel effectuating the plans that they are saying out in the public that they are interested in pursuing. So, to me, it fits very much with these elaborate fantasies that the U.S. media and U.S. politicians over decades have really constructed about Israel that, to your point, Ryan, Netanyahu and his government coalition partners have made it very difficult for them to sustain because they are saying the quiet part out loud. And sometimes now, not just in Hebrew, sometimes they are now saying the quiet part out loud in English as well. That wasn't the only question that you were able to get into, Matthew Miller, though. You also asked whether they were concerned that the U.S. may be implicated in the genocide charges that Israel's now facing due to South Africa's filing at the International Criminal Court of Justice. Let's take a listen to that question as well.
To follow up on Turkey, I'm sure you've seen Turkey has joined South Africa in its charging Israel with genocide before the International Court of Justice. Is there any concern within the State Department that State Department officials could be roped into this prosecution?
No, I will say that as it relates to the State Department, we have been committed to addressing the humanitarian situation in Gaza and have made a priority of preventing, as I just said in response to your question, the displacement of Palestinians. I will also say, though, that genocide is, of course, a heinous atrocity, one of the most heinous atrocities that any individual can commit. Those are allegations that should not be made lightly. And as it pertains to the United States, we are not seeing any acts that constitute genocide.
And finally, over the break, top authorities in the Armenian quarter expressed deep concern that the Israeli government was using the conflict in Gaza to push out a lot of Armenian Christians from the Armenian quarter. Any response?
So no specific response to that, but as we have said on a number of occasions, we do not want to see the government of Israel take any steps that would escalate tensions.
South Africa's filed this 84-page lawsuit against Israel, accusing them of genocide. Israel says that this is blood libel. Does Washington agree? And where does this put Washington and Pretoria?
We find this submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever.
So we had there, of course, John Kirby also responding to a similar question. And I mean, they're both basically giving the same answer. Kirby does a little more aggressively. But what did you make of Matt Miller's response there in particular that, oh, we're not seeing anything that constitutes genocide or would raise questions about that?
And also, I thought it was interesting that he started it by saying, look, we've been very aggressive in trying to resolve the humanitarian crisis. Like that, like if you're going to start prosecuting people, let's be clear that we tried to make it less bad than it is. Now, at the same time, they're sending weapons the entire time.
Right.
Which his answer sort of accepts the premise that there's a serious prosecution here.
Yeah.
Whereas Kirby consistently has been kind of off the wall in how aggressive he is in responding.
Very true.
Calling them, you guys heard it, meritless. without any basis in fact, which, as Waleed Shahid pointed out on Twitter, was the exact same response that the U.S. had to charges that were brought before the International Court of Justice against the apartheid South African government back in the 1980s. We said the exact same thing then. Absolutely meritless, like this is terrible stuff.
Wow.
How could you even contemplate this? It's an 84-page document that has 6 full pages of just quotes from Israeli officials. And we'll play a new one in a second if they want to amend their complaint because they haven't slowed down their genocide. I'll just pick one at random as I was going through it this morning. Is Israeli Minister of Heritage, Amichai Elihu. He said, the north of the Gaza Strip, more beautiful than ever. Everything is blown up and flattened. Simply a pleasure for the eyes. We must talk about the day after. In my mind, we will hand over lots to all those who fought for Gaza over the years and to those evicted from Gush Katif, which is a former Israeli settlement. So he's saying they will hand out land to Israelis in Gaza. It's this beautiful land, a pleasure for his eyes, seeing everything blown up and flattened. For Kirby to say that a document that includes so many quotes like this, which is coupled with what we're seeing on the ground, for him to say it's meritless is like beyond absurd.
Well, and you had the President of the United States himself describing the bombing campaign as indiscriminate. Which is a war crime. Right. So to say it's, without any basis, well, that is in direct contradiction to what the president himself has indicated with his comments. And to your point, Ryan, one of you and Emily sat down with, I'm forgetting his
Paul
name.
Bigger?
No, the Holocaust scholar.
Oh, Roz Siegel.
Yes, who said this is a textbook case of genocide. And one of the things that he pointed to was, listen, usually in these cases, as it's ongoing, the hardest part to prove is intent. So you can see the actions, you can see what's unfolding, you can make some, real educated guesses about what the end goals are. But to actually suss out, okay, do they have genocidal intent, can be very difficult in real time. Not so here. Right. When you have everyone from Netanyahu down, openly making genocidal comments, calling for the absolute destruction of Gaza. Yoav Gallant saying you're dealing with human animals. That's why we have to impose a complete siege. I mean, this is totally out in the open. And so to have pages and pages and pages of high-level government officials and high-level military officials laying out exactly what they plan to do makes this incredibly unique. And as you were mentioning, we have, this is just the latest of many that you could pick of an Israeli lawmaker from the Likud party, that is Netanyahu's party, calling for the annihilation of all Gazans. Let's put this up and I can read the subtitles as he speaks, as it's clear to everyone today that the right wing is right in the matter of politics, in the matter of politicians. Today, it's Palestinians. Today, it's simple. You go everywhere and they tell them to destroy them. My friends at the attorney office who fought with me in the political issues, in the debates, it is clear that you have to destroy all the Gazans. These are words that I have not heard saying, listen, they used to not say it. Right. Now everybody's like, yeah, you've got to destroy all of the Gazans. And, you know, the Israeli public is in the grip of basically like a genocidal craze. Because if you look at the polling, I would love to say like these are outliers and this doesn't represent the Israeli public. But the reality is the overwhelming majority at least are in favor of pushing Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. They're at least in favor of ethnic cleansing. And then the farther right are out there, you know, actively saying, hey, what if we nuke Gaza? How about we destroy all of it? How about all of Gazans are annihilated? Right,
we flatten it, it's beautiful, and we take lots and give it to the people that used to be settlers there. And you and I both lived through the post 9/11 period here in the United States, so it's not that hard for us to kind of put ourselves in that place.
Not at all. Yeah.
If you weren't kind of conscious at that time, it's hard to describe just how bloodthirsty the American public was. So this is not unique to the Israeli public.
That's right.
And people right after October 7th kept describing it as 15 9/11s, which at the time there was some eye rolling, but if you take the feeling that people had on 9/12 here in the United States and multiply it by 15, you can imagine how you would get the public sentiment that, you know what, we're just not going to live by next to these 2 million people. We're not going to, and this will get to our Treat of Parsi segment later, we're not going to live anywhere near Hezbollah either. But we're also not going to leave. So that the only other option is you're going to displace, you know, millions of people, not just Hamas, because you had John Kirby saying for years, for months, if Hamas surrenders, this is over. You now have the Israeli government officials making very clear Hamas could surrender today, and that would not accomplish their stated objective, which is to clear out the Gazan population.
I think that's a really important point, and this is another one of the, you know, fantasies that's been constructed and propped up by U.S. politicians, by Western media, is that, you know, this military action in Gaza, the all-out assault on Gaza, is about quote-unquote hunting for Hamas. Well, that's just not true, because if that was your actual goal, if your actual goal was eradicating Hamas, this is what military experts will tell you, this is not the way to do it at all. And we have now reporting saying, no, actually, the goal here is destruction. We see the plans that have come out saying, look, we want to push people out in the north, and then we want to make it unlivable in the south, and we want to ultimately push them out. We also know the political demands of Netanyahu, who wants to hold on to power for as long as possible, which incentivizes him to, you know, sort of like quench the thirst for revenge that is widespread throughout the Israeli population, and to extend the war as long as possible, because he's been able to push off the questions about his own failures that led to, you know, missing all of the intelligence, ignoring all of the intelligence, relocating IDF soldiers away from the area that was attacked on October 7th. He's been able to push those questions off and delay them until after the war is over. So he has every incentive to keep this thing going. But it's very clear that the way that the war has been waged on Gaza is not aimed at quote unquote hunting for Hamas. It's much more about destroying the entirety of the Gaza Strip and then putting a choice to the US primarily of basically like, okay, well, people can't live here anymore. It's uninhabitable. So what are you going to do now?
Right. And international legal experts who have studied this case and who have participated in previous genocide cases brought before the court think that this has a real chance of prevailing. Which brings us to the comments from the French ambassador to the United Nations, who has said that they will respect the decision no matter what, because the courts mandate depends on international legitimacy.
Yeah.
As Andrew Jackson said about the Supreme Court, they made their ruling, now let them enforce it. So the question is, what happens? The first question is, do they get a conviction?
Right.
But then after a conviction, who enforces it? What mandate does it have to have actual teeth? And for somebody like the French to come forward and say, we're going to respect this decision no matter what, is significant. Do we have that as a side?
We do. Yeah, let's take a listen, guys.
There will be legal implications if the international law is violated by one side, by all sides. It's pretty clear that there have been a violation of international law by different sides. If you look at this file from the very beginning, and we'll see what the consequences will be. As you just said, the International Court of Justice has been seized of the matter, so I will not comment on this one. France is a strong supporter of the ICJ. We'll see what they decide to on this matter, and we'll make sure that we'll support the outcome of the decision. But I will not. The same with the ICC. And the decision by ICC, we are a strong supporter of international justice, whether it's criminal justice with ICC, whether it's ICJ for international law, and we certainly don't want we won't certainly encroach their mandates.
So, do you think that Israel is taking this proceeding seriously? I know you and Emily covered yesterday, or at least I think you did, that Israel is apparently interested in Alan Dershowitz representing them, which, from our perspective, maybe they're not taking this seriously, but actually the fact that they're thinking about who they would appoint to represent them indicates that they're not just brushing this aside as a nothing burger.
Israel and the U.S. have both been among the most vocal kind of detractors of any kind of international court of justice or international criminal court. They're not alone, but they're the leading kind of voices against this sort of international approach to justice. But to see Israel kind of float Dershowitz and to see Dershowitz decline to comment on it, we're going to get to Dershowitz later in the show, of course.
Yeah.
Was interesting. You couldn't tell if it's making a mockery of the whole thing, because Dershowitz is kind of mockable at this point.
Right.
But on the other hand, in a lot of circles, he's still Alan Dershowitz, the great lawyer who got Klaus Van Buren off decades ago.
It almost was a very Trumpian move. Because, Trump loves to find these lawyers who are people for his administration.
And Dershowitz himself.
Who it's like, I saw him on cable news and they were really bombastic and held their own on cable news. So that's who I want in my corner. And so to me, it was this very sort of Trumpian reach for who was the right character to vociferously defend them in this case, which obviously he would vociferously defend them, whether his arguments have merit or not.
Yeah, but I think they have to take it seriously because before October 7th, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was gaining steam around the world. This is a nonviolent approach to ending the occupation, to try to isolate Israel politically, to force change, just as happened with South Africa. The number one kind of response to that from Israel and its defenders was that this is anti-Semitic. Why are you singling out Israel?
Right.
So, and you had states like Texas and others straight up banning support of BDS. If the International Court of Justice finds Israel guilty of genocide, it's very difficult then to tell supporters of BDS that the only reason they're supportive of BDS is because they're anti-Semites.
Right.
Because they can then point to, well, what about the International Court of Justice?
Right.
And that then makes it easier politically for those forces aligned with Palestinian civil society to isolate Israel politically, which then pressures them to change their behavior.
Yeah, and you can already see, some impact has been had by these charges, even in the fact that, John Kirby and Matthew Miller are having to get asked about it and having to respond and having to make some truly, ridiculous statements in response to that. I want to go ahead and move on. There's been huge developments in terms of the risks of a broader war. So we're going to pause for a minute. We're going to bring in Dr. Trita Parsi and break all of that down for you. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.